Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, and so grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill in good faith. And if you appreciate what we're doing here, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Your support through Patreon will really help us continue to have conversations like the one we're having today with Robert Draper. Robert Draper is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and National Geographic Magazine. He's the author of several books, actually a very prolific writer. One of his books is the New York Times bestseller, Dead Certain, The Presidency of George W. Bush. And his latest book, which we'll discuss at length today, Weapons of Mass Delusion, When the Republican Party Lost Its Mind. Robert Draper, thanks so much for coming in. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on, Corey.
Just another week in America, just normal, just let's go get some soda pop and everybody's getting along, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. No, it's been another unpredictable week in American politics. It certainly keeps things interesting.
Yeah. I'd be remiss if I didn't start. You did this lengthy deep dive in the New York Times Magazine about the Arizona Republican Party. So I was curious if you had some takeaways from where it stands right now for the 2022 midterm.
Sure. I've been following those races particularly closely, Corey, and though at this moment it's too close to call on a couple of levels or for a couple of seats, we already know that Mark Kelly has been reelected and has beaten back Blake Masters. What that means, among other things, is that the whole Trump slate did not prevail as one, but it remains to be seen what's going to happen at the very top of the ballot with the race between Kari Lake and Katie Hobbs. Kari Lake has made it abundantly clear that if she does not win, she's going to say she did not win, or she did not lose fair and square. That it was she's already intimating that dark forces are at work, trying that she's 100% certain that she has won, and that the only question is putting the ballots out that prove that, and that is in fact very much not decided, and but very much in keeping with Lake, who was one of the most prominent 2020 election deniers, and who has essentially been Trump on steroids when it comes to making those kinds of conspiratorial claims.
Yeah. If there's anything that we can take away from the results that we do know from the midterms, it's that the independents, folks that aren't extremists, normies is a new word that I've heard, have won the day, at least so far. I'm wondering if you think that some of the fervor within the base of the Republican Party may start to fall away, or if you think that there's this sort of extremist, disconnected from reality nature of it will persist.
Yeah, to answer your question directly, no, I do not think that the MAGA movement will begin to dissipate. I do not think that whether or not the Republicans have a 6-seat majority in the House or a 20-seat majority in the House really is going to be dispositive in their thinking. I think that it's true, as you were indicating, that given an opportunity for the general electorate to express their opinion of Donald Trump and of Trumpism, they will take that opportunity to express their deep dislike Trump and of Trumpism. That's what we saw in statewide races. That's what we saw in the overall mood, I think, of the general electorate. However, I'm drawing a sharp distinction between that general electorate, which includes, of course, not includes Democrats as well as independents, distinguishing between that and Republicans, because it still appears to be the case that if you're going to win a Republican primary, you certainly don't defy Donald Trump. If you do, you get the Liz Cheney treatment, which is to say, bounced from a seat that you've held for several terms, as she did in Wyoming. So, no, I do not think that Trump is beginning to lose sway within the hardcore base of the Republican Party. And part of the proof of that is that even though we're starting to hear, Corey, some more establishment Republicans say, it's time that Trump went away, we're not actually hearing any of his potential opponents saying that because they don't want to get clubbed over the head and again receive the kind of into the wood chipper treatment that Liz Cheney and others have, who have been very forceful in saying that the party needs to move away from Trump.
Yeah, no, you cover a lot of this in the book, and I definitely want to get to that. But I did want to take a step back for a second. I have to ask you about the home that you grew up in. Mm-hmm. From what I understand, it's a kind of home that's becoming increasingly rare. Yeah. That is, your parents were on different sides of the political aisle. Sure. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. My father was a lifelong Republican. My mother, a lifelong Democrat. Neither of them would fit the description of being extreme. They would cheerfully cancel out each other's votes every election cycle. But my father, though he embodied what I grew up coming to think of as basic traits of conservatism and of the Republican Party, would never have thought to demonize the opposition in the manner that we now see done so casually by Republicans. He certainly wouldn't have stayed happily married to my mother, his wife of 64 years, if that were the case. And I grew up in a basically a conservative environment in a conservative suburban area of West Houston. In my day, back when dinosaurs walked the earth, to be a Democrat in Texas was almost certainly to be a conservative Democrat, which really just meant Democrat by tradition. And there was hardly any room at all between what a Republican was and what a Democrat was. But my father, on his literal deathbed in November of 2019, said to me that he believed that the Republican Party had taken leave of its senses under Donald Trump, and that he hoped that Joe Biden would become a Democratic nominee because he believed that Biden and Biden alone could defeat Trump, after which the party would then hopefully come to its senses. And as I mentioned in the book, he got 1 out of 2 right.
Oh, man. So your family actually has a rich tradition in politics. Were you old enough to understand the significance of your grandfather's role in the, how would you call it, the Watergate?
Yes, my grandfather was Leon Jaworski, he was the Watergate special prosecutor hired after the Friday Night Massacre. And yes, I was old enough. I was, I think, 15 years old or so, and maybe 16. And I remember the spring of 1974, leading up to the U.S. Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Nixon, that Nixon ultimately lost and forced him then to give up the White House tapes, which in turn triggered his resignation. During that spring of 1974, I went to visit my grandfather and grandmother. They were living in a suite in the Jefferson Hotel. And so it was my spring break, and I stayed there for a week. And until Watergate, I only read, the sports pages. I didn't care anything about civics, much less American politics, but I definitely got the bug from it. It's a bit of an incentive structure built in when a close member of your family is on the front page every other day to read what's on the front page. And in turn, I'd always wanted to be a writer, but to me, writer meant novelist. But then now reading Woodward and Bernstein and the Washington Post and Seymour Hersh and the New York Times, I was like a lot of young people, sort of bitten by the investigative journalism bug, and it definitely seeded in me the notion of doing political journalism someday.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you about that because it looks like you did a special honors program at UT Austin, wrote for the school newspaper there. So that ultimately is what spurred your interest in writing in the first, or maybe got you focused on a particular subject writing wise.
Yeah, the truth is, I'd known since I was I think in second grade that I wanted to be a writer. But again, that to me meant fiction. And I did write a lot of fiction throughout high school and college, but was never really able to find the career ladder on fiction. And ultimately, really, I think, the proximate influence on me in terms of becoming what I am now is that there was a young magazine when I was a teenager in Texas called Texas Monthly. It had started up in 1972, and it really featured some of the best of narrative nonfiction. And so to know that you could actually use kind of fictional techniques, storytelling techniques in nonfiction writing, that nonfiction writing encompassed much more than just who, what, when, where, why of newspaper writing, that sort of whetted my appetite for that notion, and ultimately through a succession of events in the late 80s and early 90s, I fell onto into that slipstream. But it wasn't really political journalism for a long time. I wrote about crime and punishment. I wrote profiles of all sorts, and I would say probably one out of every, I don't know, 7 or 8 stories that I wrote had something to do with politics. But when I left Texas Monthly as a staff writer in 1997 and went over to GQ magazine, that coincided with the ascendancy of George W. Bush, who was the governor of my state, Texas, at the time. And it was around that time that he was contemplating running for president. And I began to spend a lot of time with Bush, which ultimately led to the book I did on Bush. And that kind of pulled me in the direction of political journalism that I've never been able to pull myself away from.
Since you brought up the book on Bush, you made a comparison later in the current book between the assumption that Bush is stupid and the assumption that Marjorie Taylor Greene is stupid. And you say that's not a fair assessment, but you describe, you get more specific in your study of that particular trait that some folks wrongingly translate as a lack of intelligence or something. Could you describe that comparison and specifically what we're seeing there in those individuals?
Yeah, I did experience a sense of deja vu, as you're referencing, Corey, when I was starting to do the succession of interviews I did with the Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene for Weapons of Mass Delusion. It very much was an echo of what I experienced spending time with Bush, and then going back to my friends and listening to all of them say, "Oh, Bush is such an idiot." Was he able to even follow a noun with a verb? And what I had found with Bush was that it's true that he mangled the English language often and was pretty self-deprecating about that too. But that Bush actually had a very rigorous intellect on matters that interested him. That's an important clause, because on those things that didn't hold his attention, he could be very incurious. But that when you were in dialogue with Bush, you had to know your stuff, or he would tend to find the weak thread in your argument and unravel it. Greene is not that way, but it's also the case that she says so many outrageous and factually unsupportable things that it leads people to believe that she's not intelligent at all. In fact, she is, and she's. I'm not suggesting that she's Mensa level intelligent, but certainly above average. Knows what she's doing. Has some very, very extreme beliefs, but does believe them. Also recognizes strategically a way to hyperbolize those for effect. And I think that what Greene and Bush have in common, besides them both being Republican politicians, is the tendency that their adversaries have to underestimate them, or as Bush would say, misunderestimate. And Green actually, as I divulge in both my book and in the New York Times Magazine adaptation of the book, has actually been quite strategic and quite serious about gaining, maintaining, and growing influence within the Republican Party. And I think that people just assumed that she was a glutton for attention, and of course the corollary to that would be their assumption that if you stopped paying attention to her, she would just go away. But that hasn't been the case at all. She is a dynamo fundraiser within the Republican Party, one of the top fundraisers, in fact. She is very, very close to Trump. He has talked to her about being his running mate in 2024. He may have talked to half a dozen other people about that too, but she's a freshman congresswoman, and that she's actually having this series of discussions with Trump about this is kind of notable. And I'd say most of all because the mega base of the party really adores her, views her as the fighter that they have longed for ever since Trump left center stage. That means she has a lot of power as an exponent of that base. And Republicans who are in the know recognize that power. One of those is the guy who's likely to be Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. McCarthy is not going to award Marjorie Taylor Greene plum committee assignments, such as on oversight and on Judiciary Committee, just out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing it because he recognizes that she has the Trump base behind her, and he has already made the calculation that absent the support of the base, the Republicans can't prevail, and McCarthy can't be Speaker. So all of which is to say that hiding in plain sight has been a real growth of influence, a remarkable amount by any freshman, much less someone who possesses the kind of extreme views that Marjorie Greene does.
Yeah. It's interesting because Kevin McCarthy, the book is as you were describing your penchant for writing stories, the book seems to me like a collection of stories with a connective tissue between the stories, as well as a series of character studies. And what you looked at, what we learned of Kevin McCarthy as one of those characters, that he's nothing if not pragmatic in his approach to gaining leadership. I wonder, there must be this tension between the influence he knows Marjorie Taylor Greene has within his caucus and what he must be seeing as the attrition, between 2016, 2018, 2020, and now 2022. There's this attrition in the general election, frankly, that you have to do one thing in order to, win your primary in the Republican Party, but then a whole other thing that, frankly, by the time you get to that point in the general, just isn't working. So I don't know if you can answer this, but I wonder if McCarthy is looking at that and how he might adjust going forward, because at the end of the day, they still need to win, and they're not.
No, that's right, Corey. And McCarthy's theory of the case is that he doesn't have to love Trump and Trump doesn't have to love him, but he can't incur the animosity of Trump because Trump is such a formidable enemy. And that goes the same with the base, obviously, that gives Trump his power. Yeah, McCarthy's not an idiot. He can count. He knows that historically this should have been, if not a wave election, then at least one in which the party out of power, his party, would gain at least a couple dozen seats, at least. That's not going to happen. I mean, it looks like it'll be more like 8. And that's even with the help of extreme partisan gerrymandering in a variety of states that have handed seats to the Republicans on a silver platter, that they've had to fight tooth and nail beyond that just to get their heads above water, does indicate an attrition that McCarthy is no doubt aware of. At the same time, McCarthy doesn't really have much of a theory of the case as to how how Trumpism dies out. He hopes that it takes a more moderate form, perhaps in the form of a Ron DeSantis, which is, I'd hesitate to say moderate, but more like temperamentally moderate, let's say, so that they're not eating their own, and so they're not becoming such a turnoff to the general electorate. But I don't, and my book certainly deals with this. The other half of the title is, the weapons are Marjorie Taylor Greene and the like,
Right.
but the mass delusion of the tens of millions of Americans, Republicans, most, nearly entirely, who believe that the 2020 election was stolen, who believe that January the 6th was an FBI setup or Antifa staged, who believe that COVID vaccines don't work or will kill you. And I do not know how that gets flushed out of the system, even if Trump were to walk off stage, if suddenly they all come to their senses. And part of the reason for that, Corey, is that there's this right-wing media ecosystem that has basically built a cottage industry out of these conspiracy theories. They're extreme. They involve characterizing the opposition party in the most demonizing of ways. And that gets attention. It gets online donations. It gets viewers. And so McCarthy would have every right to be concerned about the narrowness of his majority. But I do not see, I don't see an end game. I don't see a way out of this for the party, apart from not just one cycle of losses, but a succession of losses, or maybe the opposite of a catastrophic series of defeats, a catastrophic victory, and that the MAGA wing utterly take over and prove themselves to be so repellent to the general electorate, even more so than Trump had been in his one term, that ultimately the Republican Party turns hard against its base just for means of survival.
Yeah. I was surprised that you deal with this burgeoning industry, and I want to ask you about this specifically later, of what is it called? The Reawaken American Tour,
Right, yeah.
Reawaken America Tour.
Right.
These series of election audits where no bid contracts were awarded. I was surprised, though, that you didn't deal more. You do touch upon the conservative media ecosystem. I was expecting there to be more in the book about that. You do touch upon it at one point. You say it was Rush Limbaugh's final tour de force of zigzagging logic. Time to stop being docile. Only the left believes in violence. Thank God America's founding patriots believed in violence. The January 6th patriots were set up by the violent left. He had said it all before, and so had Brian Scott Haven, and so would others whose minds had been shaped by Rush Limbaugh's conspiratorial depiction of America. In this manner, he would live on. So I was curious if you've considered doing like an entire book just on how conservative media has contributed to, the mass delusion, as you would say.
Sure. Well. So for one thing, the short answer is yes, I have, and I'm there exist already a number of books about Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and the growth of conservative talk radio and how that has shaped the minds of conservatives. I'll also say that this book isn't intended to be a history book. It's very pointedly about when the Republican Party lost its mind, not how the Republican Party lost its mind. Yeah. And so it really, the book really covers about an 18-month period that begins on January the 6th and then the months that follow that. But I did, to address what you're saying, Corey, I did in the course of my reporting come to really, it made a great impression on me to see these so-called news agencies that didn't even exist 10 years ago, like Real America's Voice, Right Side Broadcasting, One American News, in addition to the ones we've known about for a while, like Gateway Pundit, Breitbart, InfoWars, et cetera. These have now become the chief information sources for the right-wing electorate, by which I don't mean tens of thousands of people. I'm talking about millions and millions of people. And to go to a Trump rally, as I have many times over the years, and nowadays not to see on the media riser, CNN and ABC and the like, but instead to see, again, Real America's Voice and Right Side Broadcasting, and for them to be treated kind of like rock stars by the attendees there. And then to see their behavior towards Trump and towards other right-wing politicians, they're nothing if not propaganda outlets. I mean, they don't even pretend to be skeptical in a healthy way, to be challenging. They're entirely credulous and essentially stenographers for the right, and that is. That's something that's a new development that on top of which the willful pushing out of the promulgation of the absolute craziest conspiracy theories. There were 1 million of them relating to the 2020 election, and then there have been a bunch relating to audits and all that. And again, it's because there's a very, very receptive audience for that. I do think that there was always, Rush Limbaugh inculcated in particularly conservative men the idea that Democrats were incorrigibly bad people, that liberals were bad, and maybe even evil. But so in a lot of ways, Limbaugh created a permission structure for Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others of their stripe to begin very casually referring to Democrats as unpatriotic, as communists, as swamp creatures, as human scum, enemies of the American people. Limbaugh didn't use language quite that extreme, but his language was very adjacent to that. And so once Trump and others after him began employing that kind of language, it bore a sufficiently familiar ring that easily took hold.
Yeah, to your point, you had some incredible insights into the Republican conference's deliberations regarding Liz Cheney's leadership role. And one common thing, it was jarring. It was summed up in something Scott Perry of Pennsylvania said. This is about the aid and comfort that you offered to our enemy, is what he said to Liz Cheney. The fact that Democrats are seen not as the loyal opposition, but the enemy. So I was curious, how pervasive is this way of seeing folks on the other side of the aisle?
Yeah, probably worthwhile, Corey, to draw a distinction between how they're seen and how they're described, right? So there are a lot of establishment Republicans who don't see Democrats as the enemy, but they certainly don't stop their right-wing colleagues from saying that, and they may even from time to time indulge in calling Democrats the enemy too. It's not it's, to say the least, it's not exactly a helpful development in American life that our elected officials see those people with whom they disagree as being the enemy. But yeah, this is, for someone like me who, again, grew up in a conservative environment, who's been covering conservative politics for over 2 decades, this is a new phenomenon. And as I mentioned in a story that's kind of adjacent to this book that you referenced before about Arizona, it's also a new phenomenon to hear so many conservatives describe democracy as a kind of dirty word. And so that and in a way, I think the two things are related because democracy really connotes a sort of mob rule. It connotes that to these conservatives that a 50% plus one majority can result in tyranny against them, can result in the forfeiture of everything they've come to understand and love about America, and so they really do see this, do see the stakes as existential, and do see the side as as demonic, and depict what's happening in America today as something like right out of the Book of Revelations.
Yeah. Again, it's the insights that you gleaned from having been there and having spoken, just basically doing great reporting. So, for example, early in the book, you observe the cognitive dissonance of January 6th was therefore so jarring that only a circular logic could ease the confusion. The enemy was nowhere in sight. It was, in fact, not there at all. But because violence was there, so was Antifa by definition. There's just so much to discuss about that. So you were at the Capitol as a
Right.
journalist. You've been in other war zones around the world. Had anything prepared you for what you saw and experienced that day?
No, because it was America, and it just simply seemed cognitively dissonant. This particular spectacle. Yeah, I, just happened to be in the Capitol that day. It was the day I was beginning work on this book, and intended to show up for this ritual certification of the vote. I wasn't able to get space in the press gallery because of social distancing concerns, and so I was wandering around the Capitol, and then happened to walk towards the West Terrace in time to see these policemen running up the stairs. And as I got closer to see where they were running from, the doors to the West Terrace flew open, and I saw these policemen come in beaten and maced and staggering around looking for water. I and a Capitol staffer helped set up a water station for the policemen so that they could flush their eyes out with water. And to see every time the doors would open, hundreds of people hanging from the scaffolds that were intended to be the beginning of the risers for the inauguration to take place 2 weeks later, and this kind of this visceral roar and policemen duking it out with protesters. It really looked, like some scene out of a Francis Ford Coppola movie or something, and yeah, like something I might have encountered in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Libya or Somalia or other places that I've been to for National Geographic. I just, it was scarifying. And once I got out of the Capitol and stood outside and watched people on the inside, on the east side, on the Supreme Court side of the Capitol, push their way in, and just to see, it was like seeing democracy give way as they pushed their way through the doors, and seeing policemen scatter about to no tactical end at all. It was clear to me that anything could happen, that violence was inevitable. And I, now look back on that as a kind of miracle that there weren't more deaths that day. But certainly, had they seen the mob, seen Nancy Pelosi or Mike Pence, there's no question in my mind, but there would have been, at minimum, severe physical injury. They were an unstoppable force, and certainly had no governor, no ability to put the brakes on themselves. It was an out of control situation.
Well, you do describe certain folks that you overheard, like a man with his two sons outside the Capitol. You've also done subsequent interviews with oath keepers and leaders of regional parts of these different groups. I was curious if you could help us understand the motivations, the beliefs, the paradigms. And we've already talked a lot about this, but what was driving people to participate in such violence?
Sure. I mean, it's that's one thing we do know, that the vast majority of the people, as best as we can tell, who participated in the violence, who were part of the riot, hadn't intended to do that, but got caught up in a moment. There certainly were people, oath keepers, 3% militia types, Proud Boys, who went there precisely with violence on their mind, and in the charging documents of a lot of these people who've been indicted, that's abundantly clear. But what brought them there, Corey, was that they believed, couldn't be convinced otherwise, that the 2020 election was stolen, that their champion, their great president, Donald Trump, had rightfully won, but that the deep state was locked in this ferocious battle in an effort to deprive him of victory, which was outrageous to his supporters on its face. But it also was this apt metaphor, Corey, for the greater sense of forfeiture that they had felt as America, bit by bit, was being taken away from them. And so, this was the straw that broke the camel's back for them. And so many of them, again, they would say it in their social media posts. You could see it in the charging documents later, would say the president has fought for us. Now it's time for us to fight for him. And basically, most of them arrive not necessarily with violence on their minds, but with the expectation that, I'll do whatever my president wants. I'm here to show my support and to be, to be there for him. And you referenced that while I was on the east side outside of the Capitol, and I heard this middle-aged man with what I guess were his two teenage sons, and he in this quavering voice said to them, sons, freedom isn't free. Sometimes you have to fight for it like our forefathers did. And I think now is that time. And they disappeared in the crowd towards the Capitol. I have no idea whatever happened to them, but they were people who looked like they'd be your neighbors or my neighbors. But they really saw this as an existential call to arms. And they bought this lie that Trump began, but that was repeated over and over by their more proximate elected officials, in all likelihood by their information sources, by their friends, by their neighbors, probably by their preachers. And it was all they heard. It was all they knew. They couldn't be disabused of it. And look, if you and I had what we believed was ironclad evidence that that the person we voted for president, who should be president, that the election was stolen from him, we'd be outraged too. I'd like to think that we wouldn't march on the Capitol and try to disrupt the peaceful transition of power. But I can understand if you are inextricably stuck in that ecosystem, that would be your reaction to the claim that Trump lost.
Just candidly, kind of going off script here, I have friends. I'm a small business person, so I do business here in my community, and I interact with folks that if we never brought up politics, I wouldn't, think anything of it. But I've been in these conversations where, because I do this program, oftentimes religion and politics come up. And there's one person in particular I have in mind, really nice lady that it occurred to me. I told her, listen, my program invites a wide array of listeners and guests. And I said, but, the one lane that maybe wouldn't like my show are people who are Stop the Steal folks. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I said that, she kind of stopped me. She said, well, don't you think it was stolen? And it just caught me so off guard that I'm just trying to understand it, that she said, well, so you really believe that 81 million people voted? I don't know anyone who voted for Joe Biden.
That's what I hear. Marjorie Taylor Greene said that to me. We were having dinner a month and a half ago or so, and I had more than once called her delusional for believing and saying over and over and very loudly that the election had been stolen. And she said, "Come on, Robert, do you really think Joe Biden got 81 million votes?" And I said, "Yeah. Yeah, I do. Is that the best you got? I mean, that it just defies your imagination that you don't know any Biden voters? Well, welcome to, if you're a Democrat, to 2016. I mean, Democrats thought the same thing. You got to be kidding me. Trump got that many votes. We thought it was going to be a landslide for Hillary Clinton, and yet he pulls off this victory. I heard that over and over from people. They didn't, they were stunned by it when it became clear that Russia had interfered in the election in hopes of swinging the election to Trump. There were a lot of Democrats who harbored the belief that is in fact what occurred, that votes had been moved in Trump's column because of that, but they did not react obviously the way the people did on January the 6th, and they came to accept over time that they had misunderstood the electoral trends. That is not something that you're seeing in the Republican Party, and again, I think it does speak to this larger belief that in particular non-college educated white working class Americans believe that America as they know it has been taken from them and through no fault of their own, and that this is not just a deprivation, this is a theft, and they believe that there are people who not only don't have the best interests of the non-college educated white working class at heart, but in fact are actively wanting to turn them into a minority, to strip them of their voice. And so that kind of hostility made them far more receptive to this outrageous notion that a vast conspiracy managed to steal all of these votes for a sleepy Joe Biden, that you would more readily accept that conspiracy than just the possibility that you voted for the wrong guy, for the losing guy, is hard to imagine, but a little easier to imagine once you understand, the ecosystem they inhabit.
One big factor in this larger equation that we haven't discussed, and I'm kind of glad that we haven't discussed yet, we're about 40 plus minutes into this conversation, is Donald Trump. Now, you've spent time with Donald Trump, and
Sure.
and you have this way of describing him. I don't know if it's an adjective that I'd heard, but when I'd read it, you use it at least 3 or 4 times throughout the book. It seems really spot on. The word is feral.
Yeah.
A feral intelligence. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, that Trump, though he loves to brag about, the great schools that he went to and what a high IQ he has and how he's a stable genius, his to the extent that he has a genius, it's more of the animal kind that he can. And I'm saying that without judgment. It's just a recognition of what I believe is true. That he's very good at sensing weakness. He's very good at knowing when he doesn't yet have the upper hand and needs to court someone. Trump can be quite charming to people when he needs to be, and quite vicious when he feels wounded. And so I really do find the word feral to be a very, very apt one in describing him. And what does separate his kind, what really puts the cap on his intelligence, however, whatever modifier you want to put ahead of the word intelligence, is his tendency to be his own worst enemy, and which is something that most animals that stick around for a while aren't. And so it's a remarkable phenomenon that Trump has succeeded to the extent that he has, while being his own worst enemy. But he sizes up people and situations very well. He's a great bluffer. He gets people to believe his BS, and he's really a confidence man in the classic sense of the phrase. In that he wins people's confidence, he wins them over by having this powerful belief in himself, while also impressing upon you his all too humanness, such that you think he's basically an honest guy, even in spite of himself, and could never pull the wool over your eyes, when that's exactly what he's doing.
It's interesting. If we had a Shakespeare of today, it'd be interesting to see.
Sure.
So zooming out for a second, at one point you say that to describe Donald Trump as having hijacked the Republican Party as wrong. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure, because that is something that's been said over and over about the Republican Party, but it presupposes a bunch of erroneous notions. I mean, one of them is that it presupposes that the vessel in question was perfectly innocent, that it bore no responsibility for its own plight. It presupposes that it was an otherwise healthy vessel capable of flying, and neither of those is true. It was in many ways laying a trap for itself that Trump then helped exploit. But a great example of that was Trump talking about the Iraq War, and Republicans had been saying over and over that George W. Bush kept us safe. He may not have gotten it all right, but he got the surge right. And Trump said, "Are you kidding? That was the dumbest foreign policy mistake of in American history." And a lot of Republican elders thought, you can't say that and have a political future. And Trump proved them wrong. But it's also true that the Republican Party had been very lackadaisical in its attempt to reach out to other voters, to young people, to people of color. It had expressed an interest in doing that, but its follow through was very anemic after 2012. And Trump in 2016 showed another way. He said, "Why the hell would you want to do that? Don't try to get people who dislike you to like you. In fact, let them hate you and hate them in return. But get the people who like you to love you. Get them to support you blindly." And that's the formula. And if all else fails, then say that the people who dislike you cheated in the election. So the Republican Party didn't have any other model to go by that was a winning formula, and Trump showed them a winning formula, and they immediately grabbed it. But this is not a hostage situation. They were very much sort of setting themselves up for the Trump phenomenon to occur.
It is amazing to me that in 4 short years, that the cycle from 2012 to 2016, 2012, I just remember as being, okay, we'll try this one out for a month. It was Herman Cain, Michelle Bachmann, Sarah Palin, and one after the other. Herman Cain was arguably he was sunk by Shucky Ducky.
Right.
And then finally settled on Mitt Romney. And Mitt Romney, you could say, cost him a couple points for saying binders full of women, something so benign. And then you get to, I knew that we were in trouble when I think it was August of 2015, Donald Trump, his infamous critique of John McCain. Well, I like my war heroes who weren't captured, kind of a thing. And then he was still leading the pack.
Yeah.
So something really had changed in those 3 to 4 short years. So have you observed anything along those lines about, was it just that, okay, so the nice guy didn't work, we have to get somebody, as Trump used in his 2020 campaign, somebody who's fighting for us? What were some of the other things that changed in that time?
Sure. I think that the one thing that that Romney, McCain, and others had overlooked, or maybe they saw it but just didn't wish to play to it, was this deep cultural resentment amongst the Republican base. And that's why I was saying that they didn't have to, ultimately the Republican base came to love Trump. But at first, what they loved about Trump was that they shared the same enemies. That Trump also railed against the cultural elite, against the deep state, against the enemy of the American people, fake news media, and then later still the rhinos, and so they liked that this was a give 'em hell kind of guy, and they came to believe, rather startlingly, since Trump was not exactly a habitué of flyover country, they came to believe he was their champion. And this guy who was a Manhattan billionaire developer, who only knew of South Carolina, what he'd seen of the golf properties there, that he was their guy. They really came to see that, and part of it as well was that they were so receptive to the transactions that Trump would make to them, that they would overlook some of his foibles. The key, case in point being the evangelicals, and they of course knew that Trump, wasn't some great holy man, but they convinced themselves because they were getting conservative judges, they were getting, the pro-life stances, that Trump was a latter-day King David, this imperfect vessel, but who still, was in a sense their holy warrior. And so Trump played these transactions very, very well. It's interesting because you look at his people like me, without even realizing it, bought to some degree subconsciously the premise of The Apprentice, which was that Trump was the world's great deal maker. And now looking back on it, his deals weren't that great, but he made a couple just brilliant ones in politics. And the chief ones were with the evangelicals and with the Federalist Society. He was terrible working with the legislative branch, and terrible with foreign policy and dealing with our allies. But he made a couple of great bets, a couple of great transactions that really helped galvanize his base.
Yeah. Now, something that was really helpful for me in reading the book was that you put a human face on the kinds of individuals. Like, these are human beings. So one person I was hoping you could tell us about is Jim Arroyo of Prescott, Arizona.
Yeah, Jim Arroyo is an Oath Keeper. He's the head of the largest Arizona chapter of the Oath Keepers. Really good guy. I like him. He actually, very, very extreme and very conspiratorial in his beliefs, but also very erudite and measured in a lot of ways. I mean, his view of the Oath Keepers was that the oath they were keeping was to defend the Republic, and that they, far from being a kind of anti-law enforcement group, that they were really set up to supplement law enforcement. Now, you dig down a little bit deeper and just what are the moments where supplementing law enforcement is necessary in his view, not against, say, Unite the Right or something, or white supremacist marches, but instead Black Lives Matter protesters, the occasional Antifa outbreak, and other things from the left. But Arroyo is he's a very well spoken, disapproved of what took place in January the 6th. He felt it was outside the purview of the Oath Keepers. Felt as well that on a practical level, it would achieve exactly the opposite effect. It would cause people to view paramilitary groups like the Oath Keepers as being seditious. Indeed, some of them have been charged by the Department of Justice with seditious conspiracy. But yeah, this is why I'm in the business, Corey. I mean, I'm really interested in why people are the way they are, and why they believe what they believe on all sides of the political spectrum. And I often have, when I spend time with people on the right, I have my friends who are liberals will say, how could you sit in a room with Karl Rove and not want to strangle him, or how in the world could you be anywhere near Marjorie Taylor Greene and not want to take a Karen Silkwood shower afterwards or something? and the thing is that, I mean, I really view it as central to the journalistic mission to be able to explain the world to people who may not be acquainted with certain aspects of the world, and it's become increasingly difficult to cover the right, because they're so suspicious of the mainstream media and get coddled so much by their propaganda outlets, as I was saying before. But I also think it's more important than ever that if there's any means of finding commonalities, any means of finding humanity, and letting them see humanity. I think, by the way, that it was a real freak out for Marjorie Taylor Greene to encounter me, the first member of the mainstream press she'd ever done an interview with, and that I wasn't exuding, sulfur fumes, and that I had a Southern accent like her, and that actually, could crack a joke, and also, listened and didn't didn't start, shaming her or something, but was honestly interested in, her viewpoints. I think was a really new experience for her, and reminded me that this is what we have to be doing. It's the notion that we shut out 1/3 of America is nuts, and in any event, it's counter to the mission that I signed on for.
Yeah, that's perhaps one of your superpowers as a journalist is I see consistently throughout not just the latest book, but other pieces I've read, and now I'm a fan, so I'm going to start getting the other books too. But your willingness to give folks the benefit of the doubt and to be inquisitive on their terms without a particular agenda. That said, you did come across folks who, to be fair, weren't acting in good faith. So, for example, some folks behind the Justice for J6 rally. I love how you end one of those chapters. You can't make this up, guys, but so much of it is literally made up.
Yeah, you're referring to the fact that there was this group, and look, they're grifters. There's just no other way to put it. I mean, they may believe some of this stuff, but what they really believe is monetizing it. And so this was a group that was set up ostensibly to support the people who've been indicted by the federal government for their role in the January 6th insurrection, and who are currently being held at the DC jail. The ones who are being held at the DC jail pending trial, it isn't because they couldn't afford bail. It's in fact because either they pose an escape threat, or they're seen as a danger to their community. And if they're seen as a danger to their community, typically it's because they actually posted on social media before they were busted that they intended to go out and kill Democrats, to kill Nancy Pelosi. And you can't say that kind of stuff without weathering consequences. But so that one of the organizers for this read a letter from somebody who was supposed to be there saying that this person, who was the wife of one of the people who was arrested at the Capitol on January the 6th, said that she had been stopped by the FBI at the airport, that her laptop had been taken from her, and that she was placed under house arrest in her hotel. And the woman reading this on stage said, you can't make this up, guys. Well, in fact, literally every word of that was made up. In fact, what I came to learn later, actually after the book went to press, was that the woman had one of her kids had a nervous breakdown in the airport. So they turned around and went back. It had literally nothing whatsoever to do with that. But I'd phoned for the book. I phoned the attorney for, the guy who was awaiting trial, whose wife this was, who supposedly had been detained by the FBI. And I said, tell me more. I want to hear about this. He says, this is the first I've heard of it, which is his very gentle way of saying it's totally made up. And yet there were, in real time, I didn't know that it wasn't made up. And I was surrounded by, a couple hundred people nodding gravely or shaking their head in disgust. And this is the kind of casual disinformation that's thrown out to demonize the other side and to make you think that they are incorrigibly evil, capable of the most despicable acts.
Yeah. So you brought up some of the folks, the inmates in the so-called Patriot Wing of the DC jail. Mm-hmm. There was something surprising that I found, the folks being detained due to their involvement in the insurrection, what they had to say about Donald Trump.
Yeah. It's one of the defense attorneys had told me this, and it's not, what's happened is that it has not escaped their notice that while they're languishing away in jail, Donald Trump, who had some of the richest friends in America, hasn't spent a penny to help them with their legal defense, and he spent a lot raising money for his own legal defenses, but not for theirs. And also, I omitted this from the text because they weren't aware of it at the time, and neither was I. They were of the view as well that this guy said he was going to march to the Capitol with us, and he did not. Now we have since come to learn that he really did want to march, and so I excised that sentiment because they were acting on incomplete information. But yeah, this is again one of these tragedies that an awful lot of the people indicted for the insurrection have come to recognize that they got taken for a ride, that these were lies that they were fed, and they're ashamed of it, and their lives have been turned upside down as a result. But there are some who have become sort of cause celebs and who are now part of this little cottage industry of justice for J6 and Citizens Against Politically Persecuted and other groups that have sprung up. And so they're now kind of pawns in this game of these people are political prisoners, and they're being held for exercising their First Amendment rights. And this is the kind of thing that you would never see a Democrat arrested for. Marjorie Taylor Greene and I have talked about this too, because she came to believe that all those people there prove that there's a two-tiered system of justice, one for people who support Trump and one for not, which is just obnoxiously ridiculous. I mean, that anyone who's been to a maximum security prison, and I have, in my capacity as a journalist, been to dozens of them, has seen that there is a two-tier system of justice. It's for the economically privileged and for those who are not, and that these people are not being detained because they voted for Donald Trump. They're being detained because they tried to physically harm people, or in many cases did physically harm police. So that depiction is worse than erroneous.
Yeah. I'm sure someone like Brian Stevenson would welcome somebody being awakened to what's wrong with our criminal justice system, but not quite like that.
That's right.
So I have a couple more questions for
Sure.
you. I'm grateful for the time that we spent, and I can't recommend the book highly enough. It's such a great, like I said, it's a great account of this history, how the Republican Party lost its mind. Deep dive into January 6th and various events subsequent to that. I was curious if you read John Rauch's recent book, The Constitution of Knowledge. And the reason I ask is it's one of the best books I've read over the last couple of years in terms of diagnosing so many of the ills that plague our culture, but also asserting some prescriptions as to what we can do to get out of this mess. So more than anything, I was curious if you had some insights in What now? How can we
Yeah.
move forward as a culture?
Right. Yeah. So I have not read Rausch's book. You're about the sixth or seventh person who's recommended it to me. So now I'm going to make a point of doing it. One of the occupational hazards of writing is that you tend to read only those things that are part of the subject that you're utterly absorbed in, and in a meta sense, Rausch's book is that, but not in the very proximate sense that usually is what commands my attention. As to how we get out of this, I wish I had a Pollyannish, or an upbeat reply. But when we are considering the delusion en masse, the tens of millions of people who believe all of these lies and are habituated to believing them because they, again, have this greater sense of loss and forfeiture, I don't know that that's a quick proposition at all to flush that kind of delusional thinking out of the system of the body politic. I do not know exactly what it takes. It's some of this is endemic to the democratization, as people have said, of the internet, and that people now can get all sorts of information, but usually the result is they get the information they want that fortifies their own viewpoints, and can sort of dine off of that. And Putin is certainly smiling that his dirty work is being done for him here in the U.S. That Putin's goal of upending democratic principles and eroding norms in the world's greatest democracy, all that's being realized for him. And I ordinarily, the solution in divided times has been, some kind of national crisis that unites us in the way that, say, 9/11 did. But we saw two crises in the course of about a year's time. One of them was the coronavirus, and it did anything but unite us. And the other was January the 6th, which also further polarized us. So I don't know how you wake people up to what reality is unless you perhaps address their willingness, address the kind of grievances that they foster that cause them to gravitate towards an easy explanation, whether it's QAnon or the election being stolen. And that's what I'm not prescribing, as many people, as some pundits and thought leaders did after 2016, that we need to be paying more attention to the white working class and lifting up their boat predominantly. I'm not suggesting that we turn the bulk of our attention to that segment of society at the expense of other segments of society, at least as deserving of attention. But I do think that this grievance born out of grief, out of a real loss, it's something we have to find a way to take stock of and address, and not simply to say, well, the manufacturing base is gone, you're all going to have to learn green jobs, and you're just, going to have to learn to love a more globalized environment. I'm not the most articulate thinker when it comes to how we address that, but I have been put off by the view that some on the left have, that the opinions of the right-wing, non-college educated, white working class community are so repellent that they don't deserve to be listened to. They're Americans too, and we have to find a way to bring them in.
Yeah. So last question, and then we have some business, and that is, do you have any questions for me?
I guess the question I have for you, Corey, is that, as you've done this program, how has it shaped your own opinions of where we are, where America is now? The more intake you've gotten, not obviously just from me, but from other people that you've interviewed, others you've encountered, how has it shaped, your view of where you think America is?
I think, wow, that's a broad question. I think that I have a better understanding of human beings that a lot of different elected officials, journalists, really great writers, faith leaders, it's helpful for me to understand my neighbor a little bit better. Someone who maybe I hit a difference in our thinking or in what we're watching and reading, and then I'll just cut off the conversation. But because of books like yours, or someone like John Rauch's book, or the work that Pete Wehner does, people like that, or even faith leaders like Dr. Reverend Jackie Lewis, I'm able to understand what is concerning people, what is motivating people, and how they're participating in civics. And it's helpful for me because I do want to have those conversations. I do want to be in those relationships, not because not because I do have some Pollyannish view that I can convince them of reality, but some folks are unpersuadable. But I do think that maybe as I am persuaded of the earnestness of folks who might defer for me, like the lady I described from a business group that I belong to, that I can at least submit to the sincerity of her beliefs, and then perhaps not convince her to back away from everything that she believes, but perhaps I can have like 1 degree of influence, so that's how it's been helpful for me. But at the end of the day, really what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to understand it. There are some things that sociologically just don't make sense to me. There are some things, a direction that we seem to be going as a country, that just, it doesn't make sense that folks are thinking, yeah, this is the way to go, So every person I talk to, so accomplished and impressive in the bulk of their work. It's been helpful for me, bottom line, to make a little bit of sense of it. So,
sure.
Yeah.
No, and look, I think that I mean, like the woman you were referring to before who believed the election was stolen. I mean, you walked away from that unable to convince her otherwise, but it may make some small subliminal difference for her that she encountered someone who's an intelligent, humane, individual who disagrees with her on this, but that you're on the other end of that argument, has to be reconciled with the fact that you seem like a perfectly decent guy, right? So that's I mean, but really, I mean, when that cognitive dissonance can hopefully help pierce these notions that the other side that disagrees with me need to go to hell, or they need all to be murdered, or something that you can see that, well, no, actually there is another viewpoint and expressed by someone who in every other way is not my enemy.
No, at the end of the day, I think we have to do more humanizing.
For sure.
So, all right. So tell us how we can find you and more information about your book and all the great work that you're doing.
Sure. I mean, as I'm actually winding down what has been a very rewarding 15 years with National Geographic, and beginning January, I'm taking the New York Times has created a new job for me, a kind of hybrid job in which I'll spend half of my time writing magazine stories, as I already do, and the other half writing lengthy profiles for the front section of the Times, for the Washington, D.C. bureau. I still, as you mentioned, I've written books. I love writing books. So this one, Weapons of Mass Delusion, when the Republican Party lost its mind, I think is a really, it's a snapshot in time, but it's a historically significant snapshot. And I think that this is the one where we'll look back and say that the Republican Party came to a fork in the road after January the 6th, and it went the wrong way. And it has got to do something about that. And this is the moment when that happened. I'll continue to be covering conservatives as well as other things, but I certainly will continue to do this. And apart from that, we'll do my best to enjoy life in Washington, D.C. with my wife, who I married 6 weeks ago, and
Mazel tov.
Thank you, appreciate it. And yeah, so it's it's been a very, very historically significant and never boring time to be a Washington-based political journalist. So at times it seems impossible to make sense of it all, but it's not monotonous.
Yeah, I didn't even get to ask you about your relationship with Kirsten, but some of those dinner conversations must be a treat.
Yeah, no, she's brilliant and intellectually challenging, and I've had to get used to always being wrong. I mean, she wins every argument. That's just the way it is.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate your book and all the rest of your work. I started reading some of those Nat Geo pieces, one of the more recent ones on historical sites throughout the world. So your work is great. Can't recommend it highly enough. We'll be sure to put links in the show notes and stuff like that. But but thanks again for coming in. It was really great talking to you, Robert.
No, really a pleasure. Thanks so much for all the great questions, Corey. It's very gratifying for an author.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about TP&R. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. That's www.politicsandreligion.us. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the "and" spelled out, A-N-D. Politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us: by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.